Turn your Bibles to the book of Joshua. We'll be in chapter 8 today. But I need to give a little bit of background where we're at this point, just so we know where we're taking off from. The story that we have been addressing now for the second week actually started a 3 weeks ago, when Joshua was giving the final instructions to the troops as they were about to seize and then enter into Jericho. And if you remember, he warned them not to take for themselves any of the things devoted for destruction or the precious things destined for his treasury. He also emphasized the fact that the consequences for doing so would be that Israel itself, the whole nation, would become devoted for destruction and defeat, just as Jericho was. Then last week we learned that Achan, not surprisingly, whose name means trouble or disaster, had disobeyed those orders and had taken some of the devoted things. And it's important to note that this was unknown to everyone but God. And he buried them under his tent, thus bringing destruction on the entirety of the nation of Israel. And the consequences soon showed up apparent when Joshua sent an attack party against the small outpost of Ai, only to have them humiliated and turned back. So after this happened and Joshua was mourning the defeat and lamenting how it would tarnish God's reputation, God told him to get up and get to work. Israel had become sin itself, which made it impossible for God, to stand with them as they faced their enemies and provide the conquest of those who stood in the way of them completing the mission he prescribed for them. So then at that point, God said about laying out this process of elimination, which would provide the perpetrator's identity and also the instructions for how to deal with the sin. Make a long story short, after his discovery, Achan did not live to see the next sunrise. But the anger that had burned in God's heart when he learned of the sin was quenched, and he was back among his people. And as we were thinking about this and trying to look at this through the lens of what does this tell us about God, we learned a few things. Number one, God hates sin. I don't think we can't understand how much God hates sin. He just cannot have it among his people. You know, when they came out of Egypt and he instructed them with the Ten Commandments, those were so that he would be able to dwell among them. Otherwise, he could not be around a sinful people. We used the illustration of the rotten potato, the one that rolled behind the fridge. You just know that's a rotten potato and how it smells, and you know that's sort of the way God deals with sin. He just cannot stand it. Secondly, we made note of how God sees everything. Poor old Achan, he thought he had things covered, you know. He checked. Nobody was watching him. He picked up these few things, stuck them under his tunic or whatever in his bag, took them home and buried them where nobody could see him. Thought he'd go about his business, enjoy these these things of the world. But God knew. God knew in his heart. God knew Achan's heart. He knows and sees all. And then it's important, the next step God took after he learned about all this was, okay, I'm going to show you how to redeem yourselves now. And we made note that at this point in the story, there's this, what becomes a beautiful quote as the story goes on. And the Lord said to, or God said to Joshua, every good thing that happened through the story up to this point has started with those words. And God said to Joshua. And at the end of the story, after the sin and everything that the sin had touched had been destroyed, the anger no longer burned in God's heart. He loves his people. And he doesn't hold grudges. So as is our custom, we're going to spend a little interaction time here this morning. We've got a couple questions. And now Ruth's not here. We're going to talk a lot about victories today. And given the way things went in Columbus yesterday, I think a lot of you are going to be able to talk happily about victories today. Fortunately, Ruth is not here. And Ruth probably would not be quite as happy about those victories as some of the rest of you. And that's the great thing about being an import here. Whoever, I don't care if it's maize and blue or green and white or silver and blue or green and gold, I don't have a horse in that race. And I can just pick whichever side I want to cater to on any given Saturday or Sunday, and watch the rest of you fuss and fight amongst yourselves. But okay. So the question I'd like you to think about and discuss among one or two or three people around you. First off, what does it mean to have victories in your life? And secondly, are victories important? So if you would just take a couple minutes, find somebody close to you, just discuss that and see what you think about it, and we'll come back to it. Okay, I realize that's kind of a deep psychological question on some levels. So who's got some deep thinking, psychological, theological, any kind of logical opinions? I'm not sure there's any answers, but who's got some opinions on these things? Yeah, Deb.
Without victories, you wouldn't notice the values.
Without victories, what?
You wouldn't notice values.
Okay. You wouldn't have anything to judge it against. I see what you're saying, yeah. Now, I heard the rest of you talking. You got to have something. Okay, you need them to provide encouragement or hope. And to deal with Terry, is that what you're saying? Oh, okay. Victories are a great thing, right? I think a lot of times both these ladies had reference to comparing them to something or recognizing them as the opposite of something. And I think a lot of times when we have a victory, we recognize it as something that we've done, something I've earned, something I've deserved, something I've fought for. As we read through the rest of the story today, and this is like the second half comeback of some football game, basketball game, whatever. They go, you go in it. They've played as hard as they could the first half. They go into the locker room down multiple scores. And then they come back out at halftime and the whole game changes. That's a lot what we're going to see today as we go through this story. So if you would, we're going to read through, starting in verse 1, read the first couple of verses here in chapter 8. It reads like this. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I've given into your hand the king of Ai and his people and his city and his land. And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. And then lay an ambush against the city behind it." So right off the bat, there's that beautiful quote again. The Lord said to Joshua. There's something about turning a situation over to God and seeing His actions and hearing His voice that brings so much encouragement and peace and well-being. And look again then at the next thing, the first command He gave Joshua. Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Think back to when He first put Joshua in command. What words did He use to build him up? Be strong and courageous. And as Philip has pointed out, because we naturally we're so strong and courageous, right? No. He's letting Joshua know that this has not changed. Your job has not changed. You're still to be strong and courageous, even though you've had this one setback. And looking at it through this same lens, what does that order, that command from God tell us about him in dealing with Joshua? He knows us, right? He knows our frailties. He knows our inclinations, our tendencies. He knows that if we get beat down, we may want to stay down. He knew Joshua needed the pumping up to get back up and finish her job. And then at the end of those two verses, God gave his first bunch of instructions for the attack. And it was lay an ambush against the city behind it. Think back again to Jericho. All the detail that went into God's instructions, exactly how to do it. At this point, he says, set up an ambush. God doesn't always supply all the details we think we need when we need them. We see this a lot in the Bible when he just says, go. He told Abram, just go here. When Philip encountered the Ethiopian, all God told him to do initially was where to go. So God, as one of his traits, doesn't always supply all the details that we might think we need to know. He doesn't always spell out all the instructions. Let's go on now in verses 3 through 9 as the story continues. So Joshua and all the fighting men arose to go up to Ai, and Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them out by night. And he commanded them, behold, you shall lie in ambush against the city behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you remain ready. And I and all the people who are with me will approach the city. And when they come out against us just before, we will flee before them. And they will come out after us until we've drawn them away from the city. For they will say, they are fleeing from us just as before. And we will flee before them. Then you shall rise up from your ambush and seize the city, for the Lord your God will give it into your hand. And as soon as you've taken the city, you shall set the city on fire. You shall do according to the word of the Lord. See, I've commanded you. So Joshua sent them out, and they went to the place of ambush and lay between Bethel and Ai to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent that night among the people. So this is the beginning of the battle. The trap has been set. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. For those of you who were here last week, you know the story. When they first attacked Ai, Joshua sent 2 scouts ahead. They came back and said, there's not many of them. Maybe send 2,000 or 3,000 people. That should work. That should be enough. But we saw what happened. 3,000 men went. 36 were killed. The rest of them ran away like a bunch of chickens with their heads cut off. What are God's instructions? He said, throw everything you have at them. I don't care if this is not a fair fight. That's not the goal. The goal is for the destruction of that sinful place and that sinful people. So all the fighting men went, including these 30,000 special men of valor that were involved in the ambush. We've talked about how much God hates sin. This is how much God hates sin. He sent the entire Israeli army against this little outpost just to make sure it was annihilated. So he doesn't mess around when it comes to dealing with sin. And again, right at the end of this passage, there's an interesting observation. And you got to remember, Joshua wrote this about himself and what he was going through. So he had the army in place, but where did he spend the night? With the people. Thinking back to the reaction that the people had when the army was defeated at Ai, why do you think that might be? Do you remember what the reaction was? The way that Joshua described it? The same way that the people of Jericho were reacting when they heard the Israelites were coming. Their hearts melted and turned to water. Joshua had followed God's plan as far as setting his troops up. He needed to be with the people. The people needed to be with him that night for the encouragement and the peace of mind that came from being with their leader. Verses 10 through 17. Joshua arose early in the morning. And that's another one of these things to kind of recognize. Anytime you're studying a book or a passage and you start seeing these words or phrases come up repeatedly, it's important. And again, every time we've seen something good happen, whether it was crossing the Jordan, going up against Jericho, Joshua always arose early in the morning and got things going. So Joshua arose in the morning and mustered the people. He went up, he and the elders of Israel, before the people at Ai. All the fighting men who were with him went up and drew near before the city and encamped on the north side with a ravine between them. He took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai to the west of the city. So they stationed the forces, the main encampment that was north of the city and its rear guard to the west of the city. But Joshua spent that night in the valley. And as soon as the king of Ai saw this, he and his people, the men of the city, hurried and went out to the appointed place toward the Arabah to meet Israel in battle. But they did not know there was an ambush. But he did not know there was an ambush against him behind the city. And Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten before them and fled in the direction of the wilderness. So all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them. And as they pursued Joshua, they were drawn away from the city. Not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. They left the city and pursued Israel. So this is where the battle is beginning. God is orchestrating the plan. It's a different plan, different strategy than he used against the people of Jericho because the situation is different. And we will see this all through the book of Joshua. All the battles we look at, there's a different strategy each time. Because the battles we face are not always the same thing. We can't always address whatever trials, whatever battles we come up against, we can't always address them the same way. We have to be able to change it up every now and then, to find a means that fits the situation. So continuing on, in verse 18. Then the Lord said to Joshua, again, something good's going to happen here. Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand. I want to stop right there because this is really important. As far as we know, this wasn't in the original plan that God gave Joshua. He didn't say at this point, hold up the javelin in your hand toward Ai. This was something God had planned, but he didn't reveal it to Joshua until the moment was right. So you ask yourself, okay, why did God have Joshua stretch out the javelin? And again, it probably was not a javelin as we're thinking of it. It's some sort of probably a long farming tool of some type that had been turned into a weapon. He said, hold that up toward your enemy. And he ends up telling him, hold it there until the battle's done. And I want you to look. It's in verse 18. Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand. God's saying, I don't care what kind of weapon you have. It's not going to be effective. I am fighting this battle. I am giving this enemy into your hand. It doesn't matter if there's 100,000 of you with bazookas. If I'm not fighting the battle for you, you're never going to triumph. So Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. And for some reason, the men in the ambush recognized this. They rose quickly out of their place, and as soon as he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city just as they'd been ordered. They hurried and set it on fire. So when the men of Ai looked back, behold, the smoke of the city went up to heaven, and they had no power to flee this way or that. For the people who fled to the wilderness turned back against the pursuers. And when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had captured the city and that the smoke of the city went up, then they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. And the others came out from the city against them. So they were in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side. And Israel struck them down until there was none left that survived or escaped. But the king of Ai they took alive and brought him near to Joshua. When Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness where they pursued them, and all them to the very last had fallen by the edge of the sword, all Israel returned to Ai and struck it down with the edge of the sword. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000. All the people of Ai. But Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had devoted all the inhabitants of Ai to destruction. Only the livestock and the spoil of that city Israel took as their plunder, according to the word of the Lord that he commanded to Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day. He hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset, Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it in at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. I don't think I pointed it out, but the name Ai literally means heap of ruins. And the way they treated the king refers back to several places in the book of Moses about how to handle situations like this, the protocol that was involved in leaving him hang so long and so forth. So, here comes the challenge. Why is this story here now? This story took place like 3,600 years ago, which is like 200 generations. How can we relate it? How can we relate today to what the Israelites were facing at that time? As an illustration, when the stock market crashed and ushered in the Great Depression back in 1929, I think my dad was probably 6 years old, and my mom would have been about 3. My dad's father had passed before he was born, and his mother soon remarried, and then she died pretty quickly. Left him in just a really bad, what we'd call now a blended family situation. My mom's father passed while she was in elementary school, leaving my granny, which is the only grandparent I ever knew, to raise 3 kids on what was a very meager pension. And as soon as my dad graduated high school, he left home, served in the Navy during World War II. Then soon after the war, they got married. He started farming and working on the railroad. My mom used to tell the story, she'd get so much a week for groceries. And if something happened to be on sale, and she was able to save a few cents here and there, if she had money left over on her budget, they could buy a package of lemon cookies. You know, that's how tight things were. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, I have a hard time relating to my parents' story, to their life that they lived and their lifestyle they had to live. And like most of us, they made sure that we 3 kids had the best life possible. They never complained about their lot in life, and they were, as best I can remember, they were happy every day. There wasn't any room for bad days. You still had to fight the same fight. By the same token, my kids and now my grandkids have a hard time relating to my generation. And those of you who are of my vintage and you have kids and grandkids, I think you can understand that. They speak a different language. So how do we relate to this story? In this whole 3,600 years since this story was written, or since it happened anyhow, what's one thing that has not changed? We share the same God as they did. God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now here's the tricky part. The first part of the story involved Achan stealing something that was not his. When Achan committed that sin that put his entire nation at peril, what enemy was he fighting? Where was the enemy he was fighting? He was fighting himself. And his self, that part of him that was selfish, recognized something he thought he wanted, something that would make his life more fulfilled, his self won out. If any of you have ever tried to lose weight, break a bad habit, who is your greatest enemy? Yourself. Just like God's people, we still have a mission. Their mission was to go in to the promised land that God had promised them years before, and to take it over, to just fill it up. We have the same battle, right? We talked about it last week. We talked a lot about it in our small group. When Peter wrote his first letter, he addressed it to God's people who were scattered amongst the world. He said, this is the fight that you have to fight. The beauty is, our fight is already won. Our sin has been covered, clearing the path for our relationship, unending relationship with God, because of His faithfulness. The battle belongs to God. So as these fine, faithful folk have come back up, let's all stand and close out the